welcome to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. If you like American Catholic history, please become a supporter at americancatholichistory.org. Also, if you don't already, be sure to follow the podcast, give us a 5-star rating, and a great review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about some historic shrines dedicated to St. Anne, the Mother of Mary, and grandmother of Jesus.
And the reason we're talking about shrines of St. Anne is because this episode will be released near July 26th, which is the feast of St. Anne and her husband Joachim, and it also happens to be my birthday.
Yes, so happy birthday.
Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you keep making trips around the sun.
Me too, you know.
You should keep that up.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Also, I've always appreciated being born on this great feast day, the day we honor the woman in whose womb the Immaculate Conception took place, and who certainly would have had a large role to play in raising Jesus. I've long had a special love for St. Anne because of that.
Yeah, you've said that more than once.
And I'll probably say it again.
I wouldn't be surprised. But you're right. St. Anne played a special role in the life of Mary and Jesus. She probably doesn't get the attention and honor that she deserves. We are going to talk about some places where she definitely does get honored.
There are many shrines to St. Anne in the United States. They generally were established in places where a significant French population settled. The French have long had a national devotion to St. Anne, and she is hailed as a patron saint of the French. So when French Catholics came over to the New World, they brought with them their devotion to Anne.
The first St. Anne shrine we'll talk about is in New York City. The shrine is located inside the parish church of St. Jean-Baptiste on East 76th Street. The parish of St. Jean-Baptiste was established in 1882 as a spiritual home for the French Canadians who lived in New York at the time. The first space used to offer Mass in this new parish was the upper level of a barn on East 76th Street. By 1884, they had a parish church built.
In 1892, a big event occurred at St. Jean-Baptiste. A relic of St. Anne stopped by quite unexpectedly.
That would be unexpected.
Yeah. A priest had arrived in New York City from Rome. He had with him a relic of St. Anne, which he was transporting from Rome to the major shrine of St. Anne de Beaupre in Quebec. He arrived in New York on May 1st, 1892, and he needed a place to stay just for the night.
Right. Just for the night. Right. We'll see how that turns out.
Yeah, seriously. And it didn't take long for word to spread that a major relic of St. Anne had arrived at the parish.
And this wasn't a tiny chip of bone. It was a 4-inch section of the bone of her forearm.
Man, and since, Jesus ascended and Mary was assumed, this is about as near as you can get to a first-class relic of either of them. Mary and Jesus would both have shared her DNA, so yeah, just amazing to consider.
Of course, with Jesus, we have something better than a relic. We have the Eucharist.
Well, yes, of course. The Eucharist is so far beyond a mere relic, but you know what I mean. A relic of Anne would be a tangible connection to the whole family history that led up to Mary and Jesus. Anyhow, I'm getting sidetracked.
Yes. Yes, you are. But it's kind of a cool sidetrack.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, this relic was supposed to just be there for the evening, and there was no planned veneration. But once word got out, well, the priest quickly found out that he was staying longer than just overnight. A throng of devotees came that evening. The priest brought out the relic for veneration. Then the pastor of the parish convinced the priest to stay for a little while longer.
That little while turned into 3 weeks. Thousands of devotees came to venerate the relic and ask for Anne's intercession with her daughter and grandson. A few miracles were even reported before the priest finally continued on his way to Canada.
But he was very impressed by the devotion of the people at Saint Jean-Baptiste. And upon arrival in Quebec, he told the bishop there about his experience and the tender devotion that he found in New York. The bishop, in turn, sought and received permission to divide the 4-inch relic and to send half of it back to New York. This trip was planned for July of 1892 to coincide with the feast day. The bishop personally escorted the relic this time. Both he and the relic were received with much fanfare.
Some sources say the bishop left this portion of the relic at Saint Jean Baptiste. Others say he took it back to Quebec and then petitioned Rome to send another relic to Saint Jean Baptiste. But one thing is certain. Saint Jean Baptiste has their own relic, which arrived in 1895. It is a small section of an arm bone which was brought from France for permanent veneration there.
Now they had a major relic. They needed a proper shrine. This would become the responsibility of the religious order which took over Saint Jean Baptiste in 1900. This community, the Congregation of the Blessed Sacrament, was a French community founded in Paris in 1856. So naturally, they already understood the devotion to Saint Anne.
They fostered the devotion in the parish, and in the early 1900s, they erected a shrine in the lower level of the parish church. They commissioned a beautiful statue of Saint Anne with a young Blessed Mother standing before her. The statue was carved in Italy out of Carrara marble. When it arrived, it was placed in the shrine along with a matching set of altar rails carved at the same time.
When the new Saint Jean Church was completed in 1911, the shrine was moved to the lower level of this new church. And then, a number of years later, when the lower level was converted into a community gathering space, the shrine was moved to the main floor of the church. And that is where it and the relic of St. Anne remain for veneration and prayer.
One final note on St. Jean Baptiste to the church itself, the present structure. This one, it was, again, built in 1911. It is an absolutely stunning church. It is magnificent. If you're ever in New York City, I highly recommend making time to stop in at St. Jean Baptiste on East 77th Street. So, that's the first St. Anne shrine.
Mm-hmm. Our second St. Anne is not nearly as significant, but it is closely connected to this first one. In 1931, the Congregation of the Blessed Sacrament was invited to establish a parish and seminary in the Diocese of Cleveland, and eventually they moved their provincial headquarters there. Then around 1978, the year you were born, a portion of the relic in New York was brought to Cleveland, and a shrine of St. Anne was established in the seminary.
And the North American province of the congregation is actually named in her honor, the St. Anne province.
So, just a little bit about that one. Right. Our third St. Anne is the National Shrine of St. Anne in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This one was made a basilica in 1997.
This story begins with the arrival of the Passionist Fathers in the Scranton area of northeast Pennsylvania around the turn of the 20th century. They initially came just to do some retreats, but they made such an impression that the faithful and the bishop invited them to establish a community. So, with the help of the bishop, they secured a 10-acre plot on a plateau high above the city of Scranton where they could build a monastery. Since the plot of land was chosen on September 8th, the feast of the Nativity of Mary, they named the monastery in honor of Mary's mother. Beginning the following July, and every July since then, they have prayed a solemn novena to St. Anne. By 1904, the monastery was completed.
But there was a major unforeseen problem. The area was a heavy coal mining region, and the plateau where the monastery was built had been severely undermined by, mining. In 1911, the earth on which the monastery stood shifted when an old mine collapsed. The monastery sustained some damage in this minor local tremor, but it wasn't too bad. 2 years later, however, in 1913, a more significant land failure forced the monks to evacuate. Experts predicted an even greater land failure was imminent, and the monastery would be largely destroyed.
So the monks went to St. Anne for help. They spent the night of July 28th in solemn prayer to St. Anne, asking for her intercession and assistance. At daybreak, a tremendous rumbling was felt from deep in the earth, and then, suddenly, silence. Nothing else happened. Upon careful inspection, it turned out that rather than a land failure, what actually occurred was that two gigantic boulders deep down in the ground sort of slid into place beneath the monastery, filling the gaps and making the ground on which the monastery stood more firm than ever. St. Anne was finally on firm ground.
I guess it's safe to say that those monks kept up that novena.
Oh, yeah. And others in the area began to appreciate the power of St. Anne. In 1924, a group of young people began requesting that a weekly novena be prayed more publicly. So the monks arranged for a gathering at first in the parlor of the monastery. When the consistent group outgrew the parlor, the Scranton Fire Department loaned the monastery a large tent. Within a few months, a wooden pavilion was erected that could hold about 200 for the weekly prayers. That worked for a few years, but it was clearly not sufficient. So in 1927, they broke ground on a permanent church. 2 years later, the construction was complete, and the doors opened on the St. Anne Shrine Church in April 1929.
Since that time, the weekly novena has been kept up, as well as the annual solemn novena leading up to the feast of St. Anne. Many miracles have been attributed to the novena prayed there, including a number of St. Anne's babies, which are babies conceived by couples who entrusted their infertility and difficulty in becoming pregnant to St. Anne's care.
At some point, the shrine was named a national shrine, and in 1997 it was declared a minor basilica by Pope St. John Paul II.
Our fourth St. Anne is the Basilica of St. Anne de Detroit.
Yeah, and this may be my favorite of the St. Anne's we're discussing because of its antiquity, how many times it burned down and came back, and the fact that it was part of the founding of one of our major cities.
This parish was founded in 1701 in Detroit, and it is the second oldest continuously operating parish in the United States.
Yes, the only parish that's older is St. Augustine in St. Augustine, Florida, which was established in 1565. So while St. Anne is 320-some years old, it is still 136 years younger than St. Augustine.
We're not used to talking about things being 300 or 500 years old in this country.
No, we're really not. You have to go back to the first settlements to get those kinds of ages. And in both cases, these parishes do that. St. Augustine was founded when that city was established, and in Detroit, the first church of St. Anne was the very first structure erected when the founders of Detroit came ashore.
Yeah, no, this was Antoine de la Motte Cadillac and his group of about 100 settlers, including artisans, soldiers, and 2 priests. They landed on the northwest bank of the Detroit River on July 24th, 1701, to establish Fort Pontchartrain de Detroit. Their fascinating mission was to establish a new and pure French society on the frontier, and we will probably do an entire episode just on them and their project at some point. But for this episode, we're only noting their arrival and the growth of St. Anne.
Yes, one story at a time. After Cadillac and his settlers spent 2 days roughing out where the fort would be, the first log structure that they built was a small church. And since it was begun on July 26, they were pleased to name it after their French patroness, St. Anne.
But that first log structure didn't last long. In 1703, local natives who weren't pleased with the French settlement set fire to the fort near the church, destroying part of the fort, the church, the rectory, and all of the church's baptismal and other records. But the settlers kept at it, and a new church was built in 1704. The earliest records at St. Anne date back to this second parish church, with the first baptism being a child born to Antoine Cadillac.
The next setback for St. Anne came shortly thereafter when the pastor, the Franciscan priest Nicolas Constantin de Hale, was killed by Indians. Some accounts say he was kidnapped and released only to be shot while walking back to the fort, but a more extensive history says he was caught in the crossfire between 2 warring tribes while he was tending his own garden. He was buried under the altar of the church, and he would be moved multiple times over the next 150 years as new churches were built.
The third church was built in 1708 in response to the growing population of the city developing around the fort. This church was built outside the fort palisade, which of course made it more vulnerable. And sure enough, 6 years later, in 1714, the settlers set fire to this church during an attack of the Fox Indians. They didn't want the church to fall into the Indians' hands, so they set fire to it.
It took a while to rebuild, with the 4th church being built in 1723, then the 5th in 1755. A 6th church was built at some point, and this was the church in place when the most famous of St. Anne's pastors arrived in town.
Yes, this was the great Father Gabriel Richard, and we did tell his story in another episode. He was a French immigrant who, like so many other French priests, came to America in the 1790s, fleeing the French Revolution. He crossed the ocean in 1792 and was sent to Detroit to be pastor of St. Anne in 1800.
When he was pastor, Father Richard established a school system and built great charitable institutions, but the biggest challenge he had to face was the Great Detroit Fire of 1805. Detroit was the largest city west of the Appalachians at this point, and most of the city burned down in just a couple of days. This included St. Anne, so they had to rebuild for a seventh time.
The seventh St. Anne's, however, wasn't built until 1818. But this new church was the first built of stone rather than wood, in part so that it would not be susceptible to another fire. This edifice, known as the Old Stone Church, stood for about 60 years. Father Richard was interred here upon his death in 1832.
Before we move on, we should note that while pastor at St. Anne, Father Richard wrote the motto of the city of Detroit. In the wake of the devastating fire of 1805, he wrote of Detroit, Speramus meliora cineribus resurget, or we hope for better things, it shall rise from the ashes. And that seems a very appropriate motto for Detroit.
Yeah, I'd say so. Father Richard also played a role in the War of 1812. Detroit was occupied by the British, and Father Richard was kept as a prisoner across the river in Canada for a while. Now, this didn't sit right with the local Indian tribe, who very much liked Father Richard. The Indians were allied with the British, but they told the Brits that they would abandon the alliance if they didn't release Father Richard. So, he was released.
Later, Father Richard represented the Michigan Territory in Congress, and toward the end of his life, he even founded what is now the University of Michigan. He led a truly remarkable life.
In the decades that followed the death of Father Richard, the city of Detroit experienced remarkable growth. By the 1860s, it was clear that a much larger church was needed. But it took 20 more years for it to happen. In 1886, a far larger, far more grand church was built about 2 miles downriver of the site of the 6 earlier churches.
Yes, and it is this church which is still standing 130-some years later. It includes some elements from the old stone church, including the cornerstone, the wooden hand-carved high altar, and the communion rail, the gray clerestory windows, some of the bells, and, of course, the remains of both Father Gabriel Richard and Father de Hale. But the massive scale of the structure, plus its Gothic arches, flying buttresses, and large stained glass windows, make it stand out from all previous St. Anne churches.
And while it is 2 miles from the site of the original Fort Pontchartrain and the original St. Anne churches, it still sits in a fairly prominent place in Detroit. Just to the southwest of St. Anne, the Ambassador Bridge soars over the river connecting Detroit, Michigan with Windsor, Ontario, Canada. The Ambassador is a massive suspension bridge, and it is the busiest road crossing between the U.S. and Canada. Since St. Anne is so close to the Detroit-bound side of the bridge, thousands of people who are entering the U.S. every day see her majestic twin spires reaching to the heavens.
During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the demographics of the area around St. Anne changed. The entirely French-Canadian population was eventually mixed with a heavy Irish population. And then through the 1930s, Mexicans and Puerto Ricans moved into the area, supplanting both the French and the Irish. In 1940, the first Spanish sermon was given, and then 2 years later, in 1942, the final French-language sermon was heard. As the city of Detroit declined in the latter half of the 20th century, the neighborhood around St. Anne suffered greatly, and in the 1960s, the glorious church was threatened with demolition. It was spared, thank God, and in 2020, it was named a minor basilica.
Over the last few years, the basilica has seen some fairly significant restoration work, including the installation of a beautiful plaza out in front. A recent partnership with a charitable foundation has given St. Anne a lifeline to maintain her true glory as she aids the faithful in worshiping God and honoring St. Anne. The Basilica Shrine of St. Anne de Detroit remains an active and vibrant place of worship, prayer, and activity, as well as a pilgrimage and tourist destination.
There are at least 4 other shrines to St. Anne that we found here in the United States. One is on Isle la Motte, Vermont. Isle la Motte is an island in Lake Champlain. This one is not an active parish, but is a well-maintained lakeside pilgrimage and retreat location. Its roots also go back to a French establishment dating all the way back to 1666, when the French established a fort on the island to protect the southern approaches to Montreal. The fort, of course, had a chapel, and it was dedicated, of course, in honor of St. Anne.
Another is in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. This one was built in 1883 by a priest who promised to build a shrine if he were healed of an illness. He was, so he did. Other miraculous healings took place at the shrine, and it quickly became a place of pilgrimage and devotion. In 1893, a first-class relic of St. Anne was gifted to the shrine by the major shrine of St. Anne de Beaupre in Quebec. The shrine remains an active place of worship, prayer, and pilgrimage today, and it includes a great collection of Russian icons that were brought by the Assumptionist Fathers, who administer it now.
The third of these final four is in Arvada, Colorado. This was established in 1920 as a diocesan parish. In 1922, the building was dedicated, and Bishop Tien of Denver presented a relic of St. Anne, which he had personally acquired in France the previous year. This shrine also still operates to this day.
And our final St. Anne shrine is the massive Shrine Church of St. Anne in Fall River, Massachusetts. This one was built at the turn of the 20th century, with dedication taking place in 1906. The parish of St. Anne in Fall River goes back to the influx of French Canadians into the area as Fall River became a major industrial hub after the Civil War. The parish of St. Anne in Fall River was established for the French Canadians, and eventually French Dominicans came to minister at St. Anne.
At the end of the 19th century, the French Canadians in Fall River decided they wanted a shrine to rival the major pilgrimage shrine of St. Anne de Beaupre up in Quebec. And they certainly built something impressive. It is massive and gorgeous, or at least it was originally.
Unfortunately, as the population of Fall River declined, the church fell into disrepair. The main upper church was closed in 2015 after a large chunk of plaster fell from the wall during Mass, and the parish was closed by the diocese in 2018.
However, a group of lay faithful banded together to form a nonprofit that is dedicated to restoring the historic and grand shrine. The diocese has given them permission to undertake the work, and in July of 2019, the lower church reopened for devotions. The great upper church remains closed, however, due to the instability of the plaster. The restoration team hopes to have the upper church restored and ready to reopen by 2029.
Now, there probably are other shrines to St. Anne in the United States that we didn't find to talk about. Considering who she is and the role she played in the life of Jesus and Mary, she deserves many more shrines and parishes all over the place. But if you ever find yourself near a St. Anne shrine, do yourself a favor and stop by. Offer a prayer or two to the grandmother of Jesus, the mother of Mary, asking for her intercession for some needs or causes most important to you. She is a powerful intercessor and a tender mother. St. Anne, pray for us. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic History, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters. Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americancatholichistory.org/support.
Also on our website, sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the shrines of St. Anne, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, or other comments at feedback@americancatholichistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/American Catholic History, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thanks for listening to American Catholic History, brought to you by the support of listeners like you. And Godmother of Jesus.
You mean grandmother?
She wasn't his godmother? Oh my goodness. It's going to be a fun episode.
Oh my gosh. I can just feel editing time mounting.
Sorry.